They laughed out loud when Nathan Vance paid $3.2 million for how nobody Newport would walk into after sunset. The auction room at the Vanderbilt was full of old money pearls, tailored wool, men who'd inherited everything and earned nothing. Lot 47, the Ostrander Estate, 22 rooms, 4 acres of Atlantic coastline, empty for 6 years. Bidding opened at $2.1 million, and not one hand went up. Not one. Because everyone in that room knew what happened out there in 2019, and not one of them would say it out loud. Then a man in the third row raised his card. 37 years old. Charcoal suit, no tie, no expression at all. Nathan Vance ran the Providence waterfront through a logistics company that was legal on paper and something else underneath, and in his entire life he hadn't once raised his voice. He said two words. 3-2, 50% over a floor price nobody in that room would touch. And the room broke. A woman in pearls laughed into her champagne. A broker in the back didn't even try to hide it. Somebody said the ghost house had finally found its ghost, and the whole row went with it. They thought he was showing off. He wasn't. Showing off would have been the smart play. Nobody in that room asked why a man like that would want a house like that. And nobody noticed he never smiled once, not when they laughed, not when the gavel came down, not when he signed. The dog was the first one through the door, 150 pounds of black Neapolitan Mastiff, now showing the first silver traces of age around his muzzle, and in all the years Nathan had owned him, that animal hadn't barked. Not once. Not at strangers, not at gunfire, not at anything. He walked ahead of Nathan into the main hall, a house he'd never seen, a house nobody had walked into in 6 years, and 4 steps in, he stopped dead, sat down on cold marble, and started to whine, low, broken, the sound an animal makes when it remembers something. Behind him, Nathan Vance stood in the doorway of the house he'd just paid $3.2 million for. And for the first time in his adult life, the man didn't know what he was looking at. And there was one more thing in that house that shouldn't have been possible. That dog had put 2 men in the hospital. Every hand in Nathan's organization had been told the same rule: you don't touch him. You don't reach for him, you don't get close. Grown men crossed the hallway to stay out of his way. But there was one person in that building he'd let put a hand on him. Not the boss, not the guard who fed him, but the animal's absolute loyalty belonged to a ghost, and the secret of his silence was buried deeper than the foundations of the estate. So here's what Newport didn't know that night, while they were still laughing into their glasses. Behind the west wall of that library, under paneling that was 6 years newer than the rest of the house, something had been sealed in, something worth over $10 million. Nathan Vance paid $3.2 million for a joke, and the only one who knew where to dig couldn't say a word. If you believe the truth is worth everything it costs, hit that like button right now. Share this with somebody who needs to hear it tonight. Subscribe. Stories like this don't find you twice. Now let's go back to Newport, to a cracked marble hall, a silent dog, and the day the laughing stopped. Warwick Hollis found him in the rear corridor, where the laughter still echoed through the double doors as they swung shut. 61 years old, dressed in a gray wool coat, Warwick placed a hand on Nathan's shoulder the way he had for 26 years, without squeezing, without patting, simply setting it there and leaving it. "I don't understand," he said. His voice was warm, slightly roughened by age, the same voice that had taught Nathan how to tie his shoes in a kitchen in Providence when the boy was 11 and had no one else left in the world. I truly don't understand what you just did, but I don't need to." Nathan didn't turn around. "I know what you're going to say. I'm going to say $3,200,000 could buy an entire neighborhood in Pawtucket. I'm going to say you just gave 200 people in that room a story they'll be telling all summer. I'm going to say your father would punch a wall if he were still alive." Warwick paused, and his hand remained where it was. "But I'm not going to say any of that. You wanted that house, and now you have that house. I support you. I've always supported you. Just next time, call me before you nearly give this old man a heart attack in the middle of an auction room." There was a brief silence, and then Warwick laughed, a real laugh, not the kind that had just erupted in the room behind them. Nathan didn't laugh with him, but he didn't brush the man's hand away either. It was the closest thing to tenderness the 37-year-old man still knew how to offer. They walked out together, and at the foot of the staircase, a man was waiting. Prescott Lyle was 4'4" from Ballston, dressed in clothes more expensive than Nathan's, and fully aware of it. He didn't offer his hand, Vance, Lyle, I was sitting in the 9th row, Lyle said. I didn't laugh, I know. Do you know why? Lyle looked toward the entrance, where the June sunlight spilled across the stone floor. Because I stood outside those gates in 2019. I intended to buy the place. I signed the offer letter. Then, 3 days later, I withdrew it. And I withdrew because someone called me, said one sentence, and hung up. Nathan waited. Lyle didn't reveal what the sentence had been. That house swallows people, Vance, he said instead. It's swallowed 2 already. You're not the first man who thought he was too big to be swallowed. He stepped past Nathan and walked out through the door without looking back. Warwick watched him go, then gave a faint shrug. Boston, he said, as though that single word explained everything. At the main entrance, there was a third man, Detective Whitaker Doyle, 33 years old, from the Newport Police Department, stood leaning against a stone column with a small notebook already open in his hand. He made no attempt to hide it. He wanted Nathan to see that he was writing. As Nathan passed, Doyle didn't look up. $3,200,000, he said, his pen still moving. Cash or wire transfer, Mr. Vance? You'll read it in the notarized yards on Tuesday. Will. The pen continued across the page. I read everything connected to that address. I have for Siegs each years. No one pays me to do it. Nathan stopped for exactly 1 beat. Then why do you? Only then did Doyle look up. He had the face of a man who never slept enough, and had long since grown accustomed to it. Because that case was never closed properly, he said. And because I'm the only person left in the department who remembers it exists, he closed the notebook. Congratulations on your new home. The black car waited at the curb on Bellevue. Warwick pulled him into a brief, firm embrace and leaned toward the open car door to say he would call on Sunday. Then the door closed and the noise of the outside world disappeared. Nathan sat alone in the back seat. He didn't tell the driver to move. He reached down, took the auction catalog from his briefcase, and opened it. He didn't search. He knew exactly where it was. His finger stopped on a page near the back, and he remained still that way for longer than anyone would need to read anything printed there. Beyond the window, a woman wearing pearls stepped out of the hotel, still retelling something to her friend, still laughing. Nathan didn't look at her. He closed the catalog, tapped it once against his knee, and slipped it inside his coat, close against his chest. Go, he said, and no one in that car, no one in Newport. No one still alive in the world knew that the man who had just been theft by 200 people had paid $3,200,000, not for 22 rooms, and not for nearly 4 acres of Atlantic coastline, but for something far smaller, printed faintly in the lower left corner of a photograph taken 6 years earlier. 15 minutes by car from Newport, behind the Stop and Shop in Middletown, there was a strip of asphalt the supermarket employees called the staff parking lot, and no one checked it after 11 o'clock at night. The 2007 Toyota Corolla was parked in the farthest corner, facing outward, because that was the habit of someone who had learned that backing up at 4 o'clock in the morning made more noise than simply driving straight ahead. Caroline Beckett was 27 years old. She kept 3 bags in the car. One held her work clothes, folded flat and hung from a hook behind the driver's seat. One held her toiletries. One held her documents, the only she kept locked. On the passenger seat, secured beneath a seatbelt, sat a walnut box about 16 inches tall. Inside it was her mother. Caroline had buckled it in from the very first day because the first time suddenly, she had slid onto the floor and she had sat motionless aft in the car for 20 minutes afterward, not crying, only sitting there. From that day on, it was always buckled in. At 6 o'clock in the morning, she drove 3 miles to Planet Fitness. $24.99 a month, a black card membership, unlimited hot showers. And no one ever asked why a woman showered there every day without once touching a single machine. She had calculated that figure very carefully. It was cheaper than any room anywhere in Rhode Island. She dried her hair beneath the hand dryer in the restroom, changed clothes inside a shower stall, and walked out at 7:20, clean, freshly scented, looking exactly like anyone else on the way to work. That was what she did best, looking like a normal person. 3 years earlier, she had been a senior studying document conservation at the University of Rhode Island. With only 2 semesters left, she had once held a letter written in 1862 and separated it from another page without losing a single paper fiber. Her professor had called her hands rare. Then her mother coughed up blood one October morning, and by January, the diagnosis was stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Caroline left school during the third week of February. There was no farewell. She simply never went back. Her mother lived for another 11 months. The final bill, after the insurance company denied 4 charges on the grounds that they weren't medically necessary, came to $84,312. The hospital sent notices for 4 months. In the 5th month, it sold the debt to a collection agency in Delaware for roughly $4,000, and from that day forward, the name on Caroline's phone screen was no longer the hospital. They called 4 times a day: 9 o'clock in the morning, 11:30, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 16. She knew their schedule the way some people knew a train schedule. A woman named Cheryl called most often, and Cheryl always began by wishing her a good day. Caroline had never shouted at Cheryl. Cheryl was only doing her job, too. Over the course of 2 years, Caroline worked at 3 places: a hotel in Warwick, a nursing home in Cranston, and a contract cleaning company in Providence. All 3 let her go. No one used the word fired. They used the phrase not a good fit for the company culture. At the hotel, she asked why the night shift time records had been altered by hand and pencil. At the nursing home, she asked why a patient had been marked as bathed on a day when the woman had been hospitalized in Newport. At the cleaning company, she asked only once, about the chemical inside an unlabeled spray bottle. 3 times, the same lesson, and she still hadn't learned it. On the last page of her notebook, she wrote 1 line: "Don't ask." She underlined it twice. She still asked. On June 11th at 7:42 in the morning, while she sat in her car eating a banana and a cup of yogurt she had bought with a coupon, her phone vibrated. It wasn't Cheryl's usual time. The woman on the other end had a crisp, precise voice and introduced herself as calling from a domestic staffing agency in Newport, the kind of agency that served only addresses on Bellevue Avenue and never posted openings online. "We have your file from an application you submitted last year," the woman said. "There's a position. Full-time. Immediate start." Then she named the amount. I heard silent long enough for the woman to ask whether she was still on the line. The figure was twice the usual rate for that kind of work in the state. So high it was almost absurd. "Why does it pay so much?" Caroline asked. There was a very brief pause on the other end. "Miss Beckett," the woman said. Her voice was still crisp, but now a fraction slower. "That's exactly the kind of question you shouldn't ask at this address." Caroline looked toward the passenger seat, at the walnut sock mock-sair secured beneath the seat belt, and thought of $84,312. "What address?" she asked. The address stood at the end of a gravel drive nearly a quarter-mile long, and the iron gates opened before Caroline could press the bell, which meant someone had been watching her 2007 Corolla from the moment it turned off the main road. She parked as far away as she could, at the edge of the lot, where 5 other cars were already standing, all of them at least 10 years newer than hers. She left the walnut box on the passenger seat, buckled in, and locked the doors twice. The woman who came out to meet them on the porch was named Ida Ferraro. She was 58 years old, with her hair gathered into a low bun and a gray apron without a single wrinkle. She didn't shake anyone's hand. She counted heads, exactly 6, then spoke in the voice of someone who had repeated the same words so many times that she no longer heard them herself. "Before you enter, there are 3 rules. I'll say them once. No one spoke. First, if he speaks to you, don't look him in the eyes. Second, don't ask questions about anything. About the house, about the work, about the people who come here, or about the people who used to work here. If you don't understand an instruction, you say, 'I don't understand,' and I'll explain it. But you don't ask questions." She paused. A sea breeze moved across the porch, and her gray apron stirred faintly. Third, her voice changed only slightly, but enough to make all 6 women look up at once. "There is a dog in the house. His name is Max. You don't touch him. You don't reach toward him. You don't call him, whistle at him, feed him, or stare at him for too long. He has put 2 grown men in the hospital, and both of those men thought they were good with dogs." A blonde girl at the end of the line gave a quiet laugh. One small sound and fell silent the moment Ida turned her head. "The 3rd rule is the only rule that won't come with a second conversation if you break it," Ida said. "Go inside." The main hall was colder than the porch. The ceiling rose nearly 33 feet overhead. The white marble had faded to ivory, and about 3/4 of the way down the corridor leading west, directly in the middle of the passage, a dog was lying on the floor. He rested on his side, his head laid across his front paws, and his body filled almost the entire width of the corridor, 150 pounds. Fur as black as water at the bottom of a well, loose folds of skin hanging around his neck and jaws, and eyes half open, wet and unblinking. He didn't lift his head when they entered. Ida went first, pressing close to the wall on the right, and none of the 6 women needed to be told what to do. The blonde girl walked around him, staying close to the wall, her eyes fixed straight ahead. The second woman went around, then the third, then the fourth. The fifth, a woman of about 40, circled him while holding her breath. Caroline was last. She took 3 steps and stopped. She didn't know why she stopped. The dog still hadn't raised his head, but his eyes had shifted, and now he was watching her. Ida turned back from the far end of the corridor. "Miss Beckett." Caroline didn't answer. She looked down at the animal lying on the cold marble floor, and she saw what the other 5 women hadn't seen because they had been too busy walking around him. He wasn't guarding the hall. He wasn't tense. His shoulders sagged, his hind legs were stretched out, and one side of his body rested against the floor in the posture of a creature that had lain in that exact place many times before. He wasn't blocking anyone's path. He was simply there, and he was tired. Caroline set her handbag on the floor. Then she knelt about 6.5 feet away from him, both knees against the cold stone, and she didn't reach out. She didn't call him. She didn't whistle. She didn't look directly into his eyes. She only lowered herself to his level, placed both hands on her thighs with her palms open, and waited. "Miss Beckett," Ida said again, and her voice was no longer crisp. Caroline didn't move. 10 seconds, 20 seconds. Outside, the wind struck the windows, and there was no other sound anywhere in that house with 22 rooms. Then the dog lifted his head. He rose slowly, one joint at a time, the way a 150-pound animal had to rise, and the blonde girl at the end of the corridor stepped backward. He came toward Caroline. 4 steps. He didn't growl. He didn't lower his head. He stopped directly in front of her, and then his 26-pound head sank into her lap, and he released one long breath. Caroline didn't move. She simply let him remain there. Then very slowly she placed one hand on the back of his neck. From the staircase above, a voice came down. It wasn't loud. There was nothing in it at all. "She's hired." 6 heads lifted. Nathan Vance stood on the second-floor landing with one hand resting on the banister, and no one had seen when he arrived. He said nothing more. He turned and disappeared from sight. Ida Ferraro stood motionless at the end of the corridor. She wasn't looking at Nathan. She wasn't looking at the dog. She was looking at Caroline's 2 hands, and for nearly 2 seconds, the face of the woman who had recited 3 rules in the voice of a machine suddenly failed to hide something. Then she blinked, and it was gone. During her first week, Caroline learned that 22 rooms meant 4 days would pass before she returned the first one, and that no one in the house ever called her by name. 11 men came and went regularly. They wore black. They didn't sit when Nathan was standing, and they all used the same term for her. The help. It wasn't an insult. It was simply a noun. "Tell the help to clean this. Is the help on the 3rd floor?" Don't say that in front of the help. She heard that sentence 3 times on her second day and realized how convenient it was. A noun didn't have ears. She cleaned the marble floor in the main hall by hand, not with a machine, because Ida said the polishing machine scratched the old stone. And so every morning Caroline knelt on the floor for 3 hours with a bucket and 2 cloths, working backward from the west wall toward the front door. That was why she happened to be standing in that exact place on Thursday afternoon. The man's name was Merritt Kane, and he was 40 years old. She knew his name because he was the only one among the 11 whose names ever spoken aloud inside the house. He walked as though the floor owed him something. He was holding a glass of red wine as he came out of the library, and Caroline had just finished the final section after 3 hours of work. The stone still gleamed with moisture, and she was rising with the bucket in her hand. He walked past her, then he stopped. His wrist tilted about 40 degrees. Not much, just enough. The wine spilled into a streak nearly 6.5 feet long across the white marble floor she had just spent 3 hours on her knees cleaning, and it didn't fall in drops. It flowed, seeping into the veins of the stone, and anyone who had ever cleaned marble knew that red wine inside those veins was something that could never truly be removed. Kane looked down. "Sorry," he said. "Floor's too slippery." Then he laughed, and the 2 men standing near the doorway laughed with him, and he continued walking, still carrying a glass that remained half full. Caroline said nothing. She set down the bucket. She knelt for the second time that day, and she began again from the beginning. On the second floor landing, one hand resting on the banister, Nathan stood and watched the entire thing from beginning to end. She knew he was there. She could see him reflected in the wet surface of the stone, a blurred, gray figure 37 years old, standing motionless nearly 20 feet above her. He didn't come down. He didn't call Kane back. He didn't say a single word. He watched her kneeling there for about 40 seconds, then turned away and walked into the second-floor corridor, and the sound of his footsteps slowly faded, steady and unhurried. Caroline cleaned until 9 o'clock that night. The wine stain remained. It would still be there when she died. That night, she slept in her car behind Stop and Shop as she did every night, and the following morning, she arrived 40 minutes early. When she opened her staff locker in the basement to hang up her coat, something was resting on the top shelf, something that most certainly hadn't been there the night before. A thick paper envelope, unsealed, with no name and no writing of any kind. Inside were $2,000. New bills, the bank bin still intact. She stood looking at it for a long time. She thought of $84,312. She thought of Cheryl, and the voice that wished her a good day at 9 o'clock every morning. She thought about how $2,000 meant 2 months without having to answer the phone. Then she thought of something else. If this were wages, it would have appeared on her paycheck. If it were a gift, it would have come with words. It had nothing at all because it wasn't truly meant for her. It was meant to close something without requiring anyone to open their mouth. She sat down on the bench in the changing room, tore a page from her notebook, the same notebook with the words "Don't ask" underlined twice on the final page, and wrote in pencil, her handwriting small, straight and steady, "I don't need pity. I need an apology." She folded the paper in half, slipped it into the envelope with the entire $2,000 untouched, and carried it upstairs. The door to Nathan Vance's office stood slightly open. She didn't knock. She didn't step inside. She bent down and placed the envelope on the floor, directly against the threshold, in the exact place where anyone walking out would step on it unless they looked down. Then she returned to the first floor and began cleaning the east corridor. 3 hours later, when she passed the office again with her bucket, the envelope was gone. No one said anything to her. Nothing happened at all. The day passed, then the night, and Caroline drove back to the parking lot behind the supermarket at 11 o'clock, tightened the seatbelt around the walnut box after it had tilted sideways during a turn on Bellevue Avenue, and lay down across the back seat thinking she had just lost her job for the 4th time. She didn't lose her job. At 7 o'clock the next morning, Ida Ferraro found her in the east corridor and said only one sentence: "Go to the main hall." Now 12 men stood in 2 lines on the marble floor, directly over the place where the red wine stain still rested inside the veins of the stone like a bruise that wouldn't fade. No one spoke. No one knew why they were there. Nathan Vance stood at the foot of the staircase, not above them, and that was the first thing that made those 12 men uneasy, without understanding why. He waited until Caroline had stepped woefully into the hall before speaking. "Kane." Merritt Kane stepped out of line. "Come forward." Kane came forward. "Look down at the floor." Kane looked down. The wine stain lay there nearly 6.5 feet long, dark and settled deep into every vein. "This floor was laid in 1898, Nathan said. His voice was even, no louder than ordinary conversation. Yet in that hall with its 33-foot ceiling, everyone heard every word clearly. "This stone is no longer quarried. It can't be replaced. It can't be polished back to what it was. You permanently damaged something in my house. That's the first matter, and I'll deduct the cost from your pay over the next 3 years. Kane opened his mouth. "I'm not finished." Kane closed it. The second matter, Nathan didn't move forward even one step. He didn't point. He didn't raise an eyebrow. "You did it because someone was kneeling there. And you wanted the other 11 men to see that you could do that to a person who couldn't do anything back to you. You didn't humiliate her. You showed me what kind of man you are when you think something doesn't count. And everything counts." Someone in the second row swallowed. "Apologize to her," Nathan said. "Here, now, look her in the face. And if I have to hear that apology twice, you'll walk out through those gates, and no one in this organization will ever answer your call again." Merritt Kane's face went white. He turned around. Caroline stood nearly 13 feet away, still holding the cleaning cloth, and she didn't step back. "I'm sorry," Kane said. His voice was dry. What I did yesterday was deliberate. It was wrong. I'm sorry, Caroline said nothing. She didn't nod. She didn't say it was all right. She only looked at him. And that was the worst thing that could happen to a man like Merritt Kane in front of 11 other men. Dismissed, Nathan said, and he walked up the stairs without looking at Caroline once from beginning to end, not once, and without saying so much as half a word to her. That evening, there was a dinner in the large dining room. 9 men sat in leather chairs beneath a chandelier lowered close over the table, and Caroline stood in the corner holding a water pitcher because that was her job, and because no one remembered she was there. The man seated at the head of the table wasn't Nathan. Nathan sat to his right. Warwick Hollis, 61 years old, held the wine bottle and poured for every man himself, moving around the table, calling each one by name, asking whether one man's daughter had finished her exams, asking whether another man's mother had left the hospital, and he remembered everything. He truly remembered everything. When he sat down, the entire table fell silent, not because they were afraid, but because they wanted to listen. Tell the bicycle story, someone said. Warwick waved one hand, pretending to be reluctant, then began at once. It was the winter of 1999. An 11-year-old boy had lost both his father and his mother within a single week and hadn't spoken to anyone for 2 months. Warwick bought him an old bicycle from a pawn shop on Broad Street for $15. The chain was rusted and the brakes didn't work. I told him, if you want to ride it, you have to fix it yourself. I'm not doing it for you, he laughed, and he looked toward Nathan, and there was nothing in his eyes but something the entire room could see. He sat outside in the yard for 4 hours. It was 21 degrees. 4 hours, and he didn't complain once. Then he rode that bicycle through the whole neighborhood. He raised his glass. That was the day I knew. I wasn't raising a child. I was holding a place for a man. Everyone at the table raised a glass. Nathan raised his. He didn't smile, but he raised it, and Caroline, standing in the corner with the water pitcher, saw it and understood something about that house she hadn't understood until that moment. The man with power sat on the right. The man everyone listened to sat at the head of the table. She poured water for the third seat from the left. When she looked up, Merritt Kane was watching her from the far end of the table. He didn't smile. He didn't look away. He only watched her, long and directly, and there was nothing left in his eyes of the man who had stood on the marble floor that morning and apologized. Caroline set down the pitcher and stepped backward into the shadows in the corner of the room, and she already knew this wasn't over. A person who knelt on the floor for 3 hours every morning saw things that people passed through and never noticed, and what Caroline noticed during her 3rd week was a clock. At 6:15, Max came out of Nathan's room. He didn't wait for Nathan. Nathan might still be asleep, or still in Providence, or making a phone call on the 3rd floor, and none of it made any difference. The dog went downstairs alone. He crossed the main hall in a straight line, never turning toward the kitchen even though the smell of meat drifted from it, never pausing at the front door even when it stood open, and then he turned into the west corridor. He entered the library. He walked the full length of the room, past the reading table, past the 2 armchairs, and stopped in front of the western wall, about 1.5 feet from the baseboard. Then he lay down, on his left side, his head turned toward the wall, and he remained there for 40 minutes. Every day, Caroline timed him for 3 days in a row, and the difference was never more than 4 minutes. There was nothing on that wall. No window, no fireplace, no painting. Only oak paneling from floor to ceiling, and an empty stretch nearly 10 feet long where no one had placed anything. The entire room was crowded with books and furniture, except for those exact 10 feet. On Wednesday morning, when Ida Ferraro passed through the library carrying a stack of clean towels, Caroline asked. She knew she wasn't supposed to ask. She asked without asking. "This place is strange," she said, without looking at Ida, her hand still wiping the doorframe. "The whole room is packed with things, but this one section is empty." Ida didn't answer. Caroline kept cleaning for a while. "He lies in this exact place every morning," she said. 40 minutes. Never anywhere else. The stack of towels into Ida Ferraro's arms shifted. Not much. But Caroline was watching it, and it shifted, and a woman who had carried things through this house for 30 years didn't let a stack of towels tremble for no reason. "That's where Mr. Ostrander kept the piano," Ida said. She said it quickly, as though the sentence had been waiting there for a very long time and had fallen from her mouth before she could stop it. Caroline's hand went still. What piano? But Ida had already turned away. She walked out of the library with the towels held against her chest, her steps slightly too fast, and she didn't say another word for the rest of the day. There was no piano anywhere in the house. Caroline had cleaned all 22 rooms. There was no piano. There was nowhere one had ever stood. No depression in the floor, no 4 piano leg marks pressed into the wood, nothing at all. And that name, the name Ida had just spoken in the voice of someone who had dropped something, was a name Caroline hadn't heard anyone inside the house say even once in 3 weeks. That night, she sat inside her 2007 Corolla in the parking lot behind the supermarket, the dome light glowing above her, her phone showing only 2 bars of battery, and typed 3 words into the search box. Ostrander Estate, Newport. The first result was the auction page. A lot 47, 22 rooms, nearly 10 acres of Atlantic coastline, and one brief line of description that mentioned nothing at all. He added one more term, 2019. 3 results appeared. The first was from the Providence Journal, dated September 20th, 2019. The headline read, "2 dead at Newport Mansion, police haven't ruled anything out." She tapped it. The newspaper page opened against a white background, displaying a single line. This article no longer exists. The second result came from a local news site in Middletown, dated September 22nd. The headline read, "The Ostrander family, 18 years on Bellevue, and the night no one heard anything." She tapped it. Error 404. The third result was dated September 29th, from a publication whose name she didn't recognize. The headline read, "Why the Ostrander case was closed after 11 days. She tapped it. The domain no longer existed. 3 articles. 3 headlines still resting in the search engine's cache like 3 gravestones, and not one word beneath them remained alive. Caroline sat very still inside her car. Beyond the glass, the parking lot light flickered once, then steadied. She thought about the 10-foot wall with nothing on it. She thought about the 40 minutes every morning. She thought about Ida Ferraro's hands and the sentence that had fallen from her mouth. And she thought about how one newspaper might remove an article, but 3 different newspapers, at 3 different times, didn't simply remove theirs by accident. She opened her notebook to the final page, where the words "Don't ask" had been underlined twice. She stared at them for a long time. Then she turned to a fresh page, and she wrote 3 words. Who was Ostrander? The storm came in from the southeast on Friday evening, and by 9 o'clock, the wind was strong enough to slam the century-old shutters on the ocean side against the walls, as though someone outside were trying to get in. Ida Ferraro sent the staff home at 7. By 8:30, the lower section of Bellevue Avenue was flooded up to the wheel axles, and the 3 remaining people in the house left one by one in high-clearance vehicles. Ida stopped at the kitchen door, already wearing her raincoat. "Miss Beckett, the road is flooded," Caroline said. "My car sits very low. I'll stay until morning if that's all right." It was the truth and a lie at the same time. The road truly was flooded, but she would have stayed even if it had been dry, because the wind outside had reached force 9, and the 2007 Corolla in the parking lot behind Stop and Shop wasn't shelter. It was only a metal box with 4 wheels and a walnut buckled into the passenger seat. Ida looked at her a little longer than usual. "There's a bed in the basement staff room," she said. "The blankets are in the lower cabinet." Then she left. The power went out at 10:40. The entire house plunged into darkness for one breath. Then the backup system struggled to life for 3 seconds before failing completely. Caroline stood in the kitchen and listened to the generator cough 3 times in the yard, then fall silent. She took the flashlight from the second drawer, the one Ida kept there, and went upstairs. The main hall felt larger in the dark than it did during the day. The 33-foot ceiling had vanished, and the sound of the storm echoing through the marble sounded like someone breathing on the floor above. She was halfway across the hall when she heard it, a sound from the west. Scratch, evenly spaced. She stood still and listened. 3 sounds, then silence. It wasn't a shudder. Shutters struck wildly, without rhythm. This had a rhythm. Caroline entered the west corridor with the flashlight lowered and stopped at the library door. Max was there. The dog stood before the western wall, in the exact 10-foot empty space she had watched for 3 weeks, and he was scratching. He wasn't scratching the way a dog scratched at a door to be let outside. He wasn't scratching like a dog that had smelled a rat beneath the floor, frantic, tearing at the surface with both paws. He lifted one front paw, pressed his claws against the wood, and dragged them downward 3 times. Then he stopped, then he repeated it. The same place, the same height, the same rhythm. He wasn't digging for anything, he was knocking on a door. Caroline couldn't remember when she had stepped into the room. She knelt about 6.5 feet away from him, just as she had the first time, and let him continue. He scratched 3 more sets, then stopped and turned his head toward her. He didn't whine. He didn't nudge her. He only looked at her, his eyes wet in the flashlight beam, then stepped back half a pace and sat down. She understood. She rose and walked to the wall. She shone the light over the 4 fresh claw marks and leaned closer until her nose nearly touched the wood. Then she straightened very slowly. The oak paneling in this library had been installed in 1898. For 3 weeks, she had cleaned every square foot of it. She knew how its color had aged, knew the reddish-brown glow created by 127 years of coastal sunlight, knew the fine cracks spreading like crow's feet through every board in the room. This 10-foot section had no cracks at all. The color was lighter, the grain was straighter. The joints between the panels were tighter than any 19th century carpenter could have made them. And in the lower corner, where the boards met the baseboard, there was a thin line of silicone. Silicone hadn't existed in 1898. Caroline moved the flashlight along that line, 8 feet, 9 feet, and then tapped the center of the wall with her hand. The sound that came back wasn't the sound of wood laid against stone. It was hollow, then it wasn't. About 16 inches to the right it became solid, heavy, dead. Concrete, that's new wood, a voice said behind her. Caroline didn't startle. She didn't turn around immediately either. She left her hand against the wall for one more beat before finally turning. Nathan Vance stood in the library doorway, nearly 3 feet away, holding an unlit flashlight, and she didn't know how long he had been standing there. He wasn't wearing a coat. It was the first time in 3 weeks she had seen him without anyone standing behind him. 6 years, she said. She didn't ask why he was there. She didn't apologize for being in the library at 11 o'clock at night. She didn't lower her eyes to the floor. This entire room's from 1898. These 10 feet aren't. Nathan Vance looked at her. Then he looked at the dog sitting beside her. Then he looked up at the 4 fresh claw marks on the pale wood, and outside, the wind struck the shutters in one long blow, and in the 3 weeks Caroline had worked in that house, this was the first time the man didn't know what to say. He said nothing for about 10 seconds. Then he turned and walked out, and Caroline stood there in the darkness, thinking that this time she had truly lost her job, until she heard the footsteps coming back. He returned carrying 2 things. One was a battery-powered storm lantern, which he set on the floor and switched on, and its muted yellow light spread across the 10-foot section of wall, as though the room itself had just held its breath. The other was a pry bar about 30 inches long, flat at one end, made of steel painted black. He held it at the center. He didn't point the sharpened end toward her. "Do you open it?" he said. "Or do I?" Caroline looked at the pry bar. She thought about the 3 hours she spent kneeling on the marble floor every morning, about the words "the help," about the $2,000 inside an envelope with no writing on it, and she thought about how this man had just given a woman who cleaned floors the authority to decide something whose scale she didn't understand. She held out her hand. "I will." She took the pry bar. It was heavier than she expected. She walked to the wall, and she didn't drive it blindly into the center. She placed the flat end directly against the silicone seam at the lower right corner, where the panel met the baseboard. The place anyone who had ever removed a board from a frame knew was its weakest point. She pressed down. The seam split with a dry crack. She pushed again, pulled upward, and the 16-inch wide oak panel tore free from the frame with one long splintering sound, exposing its back. There was no dust on it, no cobwebs, nothing at all, because it had never been there long enough to gather dust. Behind her, Nathan Vance didn't say a word. She realized then why Warwick had never found it. Bram Ostrander had intentionally unbuckled the collar from his beloved dog, sealing it inside this safe and covering the wall with concrete before Warwick's men could close in. He knew Warwick's greed would make him focus entirely on the tracking microchip, leaving the physical leather safe from his grasp. Caroline removed the second panel, then the third. By the fourth, she no longer needed the pry bar. She only had to pull. And when the final section of paneling fell onto the library floor, what had been hidden behind it appeared beneath the storm lantern's glow. and Caroline stepped backward. It wasn't a wall, it was concrete. A single poured block rising to chest height and nearly 3 feet wide, packed tightly between the wooden framing like a cork driven into a bottle that had already existed. It wasn't part of the house's structure. It was something someone had poured into an opening to seal that opening shut. And in the exact center of the concrete block was a steel face, a safe door, painted gray, with a wheel handle and a combination lock, a fireproof safe about the size of a small refrigerator, and it hadn't been mounted inside the wall. The wall had been poured around it. Nathan stepped forward. He looked at the combination dial for about 3 seconds, then reached out and turned the handle. The door opened. It had never been locked. Someone had left it there, poured a ton of concrete over it, nailed 127 years of oak in front of it, and hadn't even bothered to lock it because they knew it didn't matter. There were 3 things inside. The first was 14 external hard drives arranged in 2 rows, each one sealed inside an antistatic bag, each bag marked with a numbered strip of tape written on in permanent ink. The second was a brown leather notebook about an inch thick, wrapped twice with a leather cord, its cover curled from dampness. The third lay by itself in the lower right corner, unwrapped, as though the person who placed it there had considered the matter and decided it didn't need protection. It only needed to be left behind, a dog collar. Black leather faded to brown with a brass-buckled harnished green. It was small, far smaller than the neck of the 150-pound animal sitting 10 feet away. It was the collar of a dog that hadn't yet reached adulthood. Nathan picked it up. He turned it beneath the lantern light, and set into the leather was a small brass tag. Letters had been engraved into it. The engraving was worn, but still readable. Max, and beneath it R. Ostrander. Caroline saw it at the same moment he did. She said nothing. She stared at that name, the name that had fallen from Ida Ferraro's mouth on Wednesday morning and never returned, then at the name above it, and she didn't understand. Yet she understood that something had just broken open inside that room. Then she looked at Nathan's hand. The hand holding the collar was trembling. Not much, just enough for the brass tag to touch the brass buckle twice, making 2 tiny clicking sounds beneath the roar of the storm. The man who had watched her kneel over the red wine stain for 40 seconds without moving a single muscle in his face. The man who had said $3,200,000 in the voice of someone ordering coffee. His hand was shaking, and he didn't hide it because he didn't know it was shaking. Then Max stood. He came forwards one joint at a time, exactly as he had walked toward Caroline on her first morning. He didn't look at Nathan. He looked at the collar. Nathan lowered his hand very slowly and placed it on the wooden floor. The dog bent his head and smelled it once. Then he lay down right there, among the broken oak panels and concrete dust, and rested his heavy muzzle on the black leather faded to brown. He didn't whine. He didn't move. He lay there like that, and he wouldn't stand again. The power came back at 4 o'clock in the morning, and no one in the library noticed because both of them were watching the dog lying over the strip of black leather. At 9 o'clock on Saturday morning, Nathan Vance called a telephone number he hadn't called in 6 years. The animal rescue shelter was in Fall River, Massachusetts, a 40-minute drive from Newport across the bridge. The woman who answered sounded tired, and when he said he needed the records from September of 2019, she told him the old files were stored in the basement, and that she would call him back. She called again 40 minutes later. He put the call on speaker. Caroline sat in the armchair about 10 feet away, and he didn't tell her to leave. September 23rd, the woman read. 4:10 in the morning. The overnight employee found him at the rear entrance, tied to the bars with a length of rope. How old was he? The veterinarian estimated approximately 2 years. Male purebred Neapolitan Mastiff, 141 pounds. She turned of age. No collar, no tag, no papers, microchip. There was a pause. Here, she said. This is the part I remember about the case. The veterinarian's note. The scanner didn't detect anything, so they shaved the area around his shoulder blades to look. There was a scar. An incision about 4/10 of an inch long, already healed, estimated to be several weeks old. The suturing was clean, the stitches were dissolvable, and there was no infection. She continued reading, her voice slowing. The veterinarian wrote these exact words. The chip had been surgically removed. It didn't fall out. It didn't migrate. Someone opened his skin, removed the chip, stitched him back up, and did it properly. No one in the library spoke. Your cameras that night? Nathan asked. They failed, the woman said. The recording system was down from 11 o'clock the previous night until 6 o'clock the next morning. A technician came 2 days later and said there had been an electrical short. We didn't notify the police because there was nothing to report. People leave dogs at our door every week, Mr. Vance. Why was he there so long? 3 months, she exhaled. He didn't bite anyone. He didn't bark. He only lay there. But he weighed 141 pounds, and he looked at people in a way that made them uncomfortable. 4 families came to see him. 4 families went home. We had scheduled him for December 18th. She didn't say the word. Then you came. Nathan ended the call. He said nothing for a long time. 6 years earlier, he had driven across the Braga Bridge for a reason that had nothing to do with dogs, and he had stopped there for a reason he had never told anyone. And he had walked out with a 141-pound animal, with no papers, no name, and nothing else. He had named the dog in the car. He had thought of that name himself. He was certain he had thought of that name himself. Or perhaps he hadn't. Perhaps, in some forgotten corner of his memory, he had once heard Warwick whip that name in connection with the Ostrander estate years ago, a seed planted in his mind that only bloomed when he saw the silent animal. On the library floor, about 6.5 feet from his feet, the dog still lay with his muzzle resting on the brass tag engraved with the name Max and, beneath it, R. Ostrander, and that collar had been sealed inside the concrete block. Someone cut open the dog's skin and removed the microchip from his body at 4 o'clock in the morning. The 37-year-old man now knew who his dog had once belonged to. He didn't know why Max had been left at the rear entrance of a rescue shelter in another state. He didn't know who had driven him across the bridge. He didn't know why that person hadn't killed him, but had instead gone to the trouble of sedating him, cutting into his skin, stitching him back together, and leaving him in a place where he would die 3 months later without anyone asking a single question. His specialist arrived at 2 o'clock that afternoon, a man named Halloran who worked for a logistics company on paper. He sat before the 14 antistatic bags for 4 hours, and when he finally looked up, his expression wasn't good. Full disk encryption, he said. Not the kind I can break. Not the kind anyone will break in our lifetime. What else? Something worse. Halloran picked up one of the drives. This sat against concrete for 6 years. Concrete holds moisture. This is a mechanical drive, not a solid-state drive. The red head inside has adhered to the platter. If you connect it to power right now, the head will scrape the platter clean in 2 seconds, and everything stored on it will be gone forever. He set it down very gently. Do you have the password? No. Then these 14 things are 14 paperweights, Halloran said. Don't plug them in. Don't shake them. Don't breathe too hard near them. That left the notebook. Nathan carried it to the reading table beneath the lamp. The brown leather cover had curled upward like a shell. He unwound the binding cord, and it crumbled into fibers in his hand. He opened the cover. The first page was still legible. The second page was still legible. The third page had adhered to the fourth, and the fourth to the fifth, and from that point onward, the notebook was no longer a notebook. It was a solid mass of paper that had grown damp, dried, and grown damp again 6 times through 6 Rhode Island winters, while the ink inside had bled from one page into another in pale blue stains. Nathan placed his thumb against the edge of a page. He pulled gently. A fragment the size of a fingernail peeled away from the corner and fell onto the table like a scale. He sat motionless for 3 seconds. Then he reached inside his coat and drew out a knife. Don't. There were 4 people in the library. Nathan stood at the reading table with the knife in his hand. Halloran stood beside the 14 hard drives. 2 men dressed in black stood at the door. And all 4 heads turned at once because no one in this house had ever spoken that word to Nathan Vance. And the person who had just said it was holding a cleaning cloth. Caroline rose from the armchair. She walked to the reading table and didn't stop at a polite distance. She leaned over the notebook until her face was about 8 inches from the paper, and she studied it for 4 seconds. If you cut into that page, it's gone forever, she said. Not the writing. The page, one of the 2 men at the door shifted. Nathan raised 2 fingers about an inch, and the man went still. Go on. These pages aren't bonded with glue. They're stuck because the cellulose fibers from both pages interlocked when they grew damp and then dried again. 6 times. 6 winters. They're no longer 2 sheets of paper. They're one solid mass. She pointed without touching. If you slide a blade between them, They'll separate along the path of the blade, not along the grain of the paper. You'll peel the upper surface of this page onto the underside of the next one. The inksy sits on the surface. When you cut through the surface, you cut through the words. What you'll be left holding afterward will be 2 blank pieces of paper with a few blue stains, and no one alive will ever be able to restore them. It won't be difficult. It'll be impossible. Halloran cleared his throat softly. What do you need? Nathan asked. A humidity chamber. You can't spray water on it. That would destroy it. The moisture has to enter through the air slowly at about 75% humidity, held steady for 6 hours so the paper fibers can expand and release one another. Then the pages have to be separated with a microspatula, the kind with a blade about 0.02 of a millimeter thick, working inward from the outer edge, following the grain instead of moving in a straight line. Each pair of pages will take 40 minutes to an hour. There are about 40 pages stuck together in this notebook. I'll need 8 hours for the first 10 pages, and I won't know how long the next 10 will take until I've opened the first 10. She straightened. And if anyone makes one mistake, there won't be a second chance. The library fell silent. Nathan Vance placed the knife on the table. He didn't put it away. He only set it down and looked at the 27-year-old woman standing before him with a cleaning cloth in her left hand. Why are you cleaning floors? The question hung in the air. The 2 men at the door lowered their eyes. Halloran lowered his eyes. Caroline didn't. Because a degree in document conservation doesn't pay $84,312 of medical debt, she said, her voice dropping but remaining perfectly steady. My mother died of cancer, and the collection agency calls me 4 times a day on a strict schedule. No one in Newport hires a senior who walked away with 2 semesters left, no matter how rare her hands are. Cleaning floors doesn't require a background check, and it pays in cash on Friday. I do what I must to survive. She looked directly into his eyes, breaking Ida Ferraro's first rule without blinking. Is there anything else you'd like to ask? No one in the library breathed. Nathan Vance looked at her. He didn't apologize. He didn't say he hadn't known. He didn't mention the $2,000 are inside the unmarked envelope, and he didn't make a single promise about the $84,312. And Caroline didn't ask him to. Tell me what you need, he said. It wasn't a question. A table, Caroline said. Long level and not this antique one. Daylight lamps at 6,000 Kelvin. A humidifier with a built-in gauge and a separate hygrometer so I can verify that gauge. A set of microspatulas. A powder-free nitrile gloves. And a lock on this door. She drew in a breath. And no one stands behind me. No one. Not you. Not them. Not anyone. I can't separate cellulose fibers while someone is breathing down my neck. Nathan Vance stood. He looked around his own library, at the 2 walls of books, the 19th century reading table, the 14 hard drives, the dog lying over the strip of black leather in the corner, and the 10 feet of shattered oak paneling beneath the western wall. Halloran, he said. Out. Halloran left. You 2 as well. The 2 men at the door left. Nathan walked to the threshold and stopped there without turning around. Everything on your list will be here before 3 o'clock this afternoon, he said. This room is yours. Lock it. Then he walked out and closed the door behind him. Caroline Beckett stood alone in the library of a house worth $3,200,000, and she didn't thank anyone. The items on the list arrived at 2:40. By 6 o'clock on Sunday evening, the library was no longer a library. A 10-foot table stood in the middle of the room. 6,000 Kelvin lamps hung low above it. A clear plastic humidity chamber rested at one end, and a new lock had been installed on the door. Caroline locked it. Pages 1 through 4 weren't stuck together. They were only curled. She flattened them beneath glass for 2 hours, and read them through the head-mounted magnifier. And on the 3rd line of the first page she found a name. Bram Ostrander. The handwriting was small and even, slanting slightly to the right, the hand of a man who wrote numbers more often than words. The first page was a list, not a diary. It was a ledger of dates with a number beside each date and a string of abbreviated characters beside each number. Caroline didn't understand them, but she understood the far-right column because it showed a running total, and the final figure on page 4 was $10,200,000. Pages 5 through 14 were fused into a single block. She placed them inside the humidity chamber at 7 o'clock that evening, and sat watching the gauge climb to 75% and remain there. She didn't go anywhere. At 1 o'clock in the morning, She opened the chamber and began separating the pages. 43 minutes for the first pair. 38 minutes for the second. By 6 o'clock on Monday morning, she had recovered 8 pages, and she knew who Bram Ostrander had been. He had served as chief accountant for the Vance organization for 18 years. Page 7 stated the title clearly in his own hand, in a sentence that began, "For 18 years, I signed everything without asking." He was 52 when he wrote those words. He had lived in the house where Caroline now sat. The piano had once stood directly behind her. On page 9, he began counting. He wrote that he had discovered it because of a rounding error. 42 cents. A payment to a transportation company in Warkpet differed from the original invoice by 42 cents, and Bram Ostrander was the kind of man who couldn't sleep because of 42 cents. So he pulled the ledger, then kept pulling, and continued pulling for 11 months, 6 companies. He listed them on page 11, a transportation company in Warwick, a harbor maintenance company in East Providence, a consulting firm in Delaware with no employees, a real estate investment fund in Florida that owned only a single parking lot, an import-export company in New Jersey, and a legal entity in Liechtenstein whose full name he couldn't fit on the page, so he recorded only its registration number. The money moved through them in that exact order. It entered in Warwick and emerged in Liechtenstein. $10,200,000 over 3 years. Not a single cent ever traveled back in the opposite direction. Page 13 was where Caroline stopped working and sat motionless for a very long time. Bram Ostrander had written, "I have sat with this for 9 weeks. I can't bring it to the boss, not because I am afraid of the boss, but because every transfer order carries an approval signature, and I know that signature. The person approving them is the man who sits beside the boss. If I bring this to the table, I will place it in front of 2 men, and one of those men will know what I have found before I even open my mouth." On page 14, he stopped using names. He wrote, "From this point forward, I will write no names. If anyone is reading this notebook, then I am already dead, and the name inside it will kill more people. I will call him the gardener. He will understand why. And if the reader is patient enough to reach the end, that person will understand too." Caroline read it 3 times. Then she turned to page 15. It was fused to page 16. She looked at the clock, 6:40 in the morning. She placed the pair inside the humidity chamber, closed the lid, set the timer for 6 hours, and fell asleep with her head on the table, the magnifier still strapped around her forehead. At the other end of the house, at 2:20 that same morning, Merritt Kane stood on the eastern porch where there were no cameras and made a telephone call. He didn't use his own phone. He used a black flip phone purchased with cash from a convenience store on Broad Street. He spoke for 40 seconds. No one knew who was on the other end. No camera captured it. The only other person still awake in the house was sitting nearly 72 feet away, behind a locked door, bent over a notebook, and she heard nothing. Kane ended the call. He removed the battery, snapped the SIM card in half, and threw both over the cliff. Then he stood there for a while, staring out at the Black Sea. He turned back toward the house, past the locked library door, and stopped there for exactly 1.5 seconds before continuing on. At 3:12 the following morning, the library door opened without making a sound. Merritt Kane didn't break the lock. He had a key. He had worked in the organization for 11 years, and he knew where Ida Ferraro kept the spare keys. He knew the lock installed on Sunday was a cheap model bought in haste, and he knew the 3:00 in the morning was when the 2 men on the night watch changed positions at the gate. He wore soft shoes. He carried a flashlight wrapped in red cloth. His target wasn't the notebook on the table. He walked straight toward the western wall, toward the steel safe embedded in the concrete block, and he had taken 3 steps into the room when he stopped. Something stood between him and the wall. Max didn't bark. He didn't growl. He didn't bare his teeth. He only stood there in the middle of the passage, 150 pounds, his head lowered slightly, watching him. Kane remained still for 10 seconds. Then he stepped to the left. The dog stepped to the left. He stepped to the right. The dog stepped to the right. Max didn't chase him. He didn't advance. He simply remained between Kane and the wall, and he stayed there every time Kane changed direction. And Kane understood that the animal had no intention of doing anything to him. He simply wasn't going to move aside. Kane reached into his inner pocket. The stun baton was about 12 inches long, black, with no pointed end. He pressed the button once. There was a sharp crackle, and a blue spark leaped between the two contact points, flashing through the dark room, and that light reflected in the dog's wet eyes. Max didn't step back. Kane swung. He was fast. He had done this before, but he struck at the place where a dog should have been standing. And the dog was no longer there because Max had lowered his shoulder and turned to the left before Kane's arm had fully ended. 150 pounds moved through the hips, not the legs, and the dog didn't bite him, didn't leap onto him, didn't even open his mouth. He only drove his body forward. The full weight of his shoulder slammed into Kane's ribs, while the man was still off balance, and the 40-year-old man, who weighed nearly 200 pounds, flew more than 8 feet sideways and struck the oak bookcase with his back. Books came crashing down. The stun baton flew from his hand, slid across the floor, and went dark. Kane struggled onto his hands and knees. He reached for the baton. He didn't see the rug. The Persian rug running through the library was 13 feet long and very heavy, and Caroline Beckett was gripping its edge with both hands, and she had been holding it from the moment Kane was still in the air. She pulled. She didn't jerk it. She pulled with her entire body. Both feet braced against the wooden floor, while Kane rested on one hand and one knee directly on that rug. The floor beneath him vanished. He fell face first, his chin striking the floor, and before he could plant his hand again, she pulled one more time and rolled the edge of the rug around his right arm. He was trapped for only 4 seconds. 4 seconds was enough. The dog was already there, standing on the rug directly in front of him, and Max still didn't bite, but 150 pounds pressed down on the rug wrapped around Kane's arm meant he wasn't going anywhere. The lights came on at 3:16. The 2 night guards entered first, followed by Halloran and then Nathan Vance. He wore a shirt with the collar unbuttoned, and he stood in the doorway studying the scene for about 5 seconds. One fallen bookcase, one stun baton lying in the middle of the floor, one of his men lying face down beneath a Persian rug with his arm tightly wrapped inside it, one dog standing motionless, and one 27-year-old woman breathing hard, still gripping the edge of the rug, her head-mounted magnifier hanging crookedly to one side. "Are you hurt?" Nathan said. He didn't look at Kane. Caroline shook her head. She released the rug, walked straight to the table, and did the first thing that came into her mind. She checked the humidity chamber. The gauge still read 75%. Pages 15 and 16 were still inside, untouched. She placed both hands on the table and remained that way for a while. They pulled Merritt Kane out of the rug. He didn't resist. His breathing was heavy, his chin was swollen, and when he passed Nathan, he said nothing. But he turned his head and looked at Caroline once, only once, and it was the same look he had given her from the far end of the dining table, except now there was no longer any need to hide it. They locked him inside the basement pump room, behind a steel door with no windows, and stationed one man outside. Nathan entered the library again at 3:40. He picked the stun baton up from the floor, held it in his hand, and stared at it for a long time. The dog had returned to the corner of the room. He lay down beside the black leather faded to brown, rested his muzzle upon it, and closed his eyes. At 4:15 in the morning, inside the basement pump room, Nathan Vance pulled over a plastic chair and sat down across from Merritt Kane, and he brought no one with him. "You didn't go in there for the notebook," he said. The notebook was sitting on the table, unlocked, 13 feet from the door. "You walked past it. You went straight to the wall." Kane didn't answer, which means you knew the safe was there. "Which means you knew before I did." Kane sat with his back against a water pipe, his chin swollen, staring down at his feet. 11 years, Nathan said. "You ate at my table, so I'm going to ask once, and I'm going to ask politely." Kane looked up. And he laughed. It wasn't a defiant laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had just heard a joke from someone who didn't realize he was telling one. "You're going to ask about Lyle, aren't you?" he said. "You're sitting here, in your head, you're already in Boston. Prescott Lyle. Right?" Nathan said nothing. "Lyle doesn't know anything," Kane said. "Lyle is clean. Lyle is so clean that if he knew 1/10 of what was sitting behind that wall, he would have pissed himself and run back to Boston in 2019. Why do you think he withdrew his offer?" "Because he smelled something, and he was smart enough not to ask what the smell was. He's the only person in this whole thing who made the right choice." He tilted his head. "You've been fighting the wrong man for 6 years, boss." Nathan sat very still. "Then who?" Merritt Kane looked at him, and for 2 seconds something in his face changed, and it wasn't stubbornness. It was fear, not fear of Nathan. He was sitting inside a steel room with a man who could make him disappear before breakfast. And that wasn't the man he feared. You know what the funniest part is, he said. I don't know either. 11 years, and I've never seen a face. No name, no real voice. Only money and a number. He rested his head against the wall behind him. And now that I'm sitting in here, I know he will never let me live to talk. I'd rather choose my own way out than face what he does to traitors. He bit down hard on his back molar, a tiny glass capsule cracking quietly between his teeth. Those were the last words Merritt Kane ever spoke. At 6:50 that morning, the guard opened the door to bring in coffee and found him lying on his side on the concrete floor. There were no wounds, no marks around his neck. The steel door had remained locked from the outside for 3 hours. One man had outsized for all 3 hours. The hallway camera had recorded continuously for all 3 hours, and no one had passed through. The backup camera inside the pump room itself had captured the entire sequence, Kane's sudden movement, the cracking of the glass capsule between his teeth, and his swift demise. It was a clear, indisputable suicide. Legally, Nathan could not be held for murder, yet having a prominent associate die under lock and key in his basement was a public relations nightmare. Detective Whitaker Doyle arrived at 9:20. He brought no warrant. He stood in the marble hall with his notebook already open, writing as he spoke. 6 years, he said, Mr. Vance. This is the third person to die immediately after becoming involved with this address. The first and second died in September of 2019. The third is lying in your basement. Nathan didn't answer. I sent the file to the FBI offices in Boston this morning, Doyle said. All 3 cases. I went over my chief's head, and I'll pay for that, and I don't care. He closed the notebook. Then he drew something from the breast pocket of his coat. A business card, its edges curled. The printing faded in one corner as though it had been carried in someone's wallet for a very long time. In 2019, there was a man writing about this house, Doyle said. He wrote 3 articles. The third was published on September 29th. On October 4th, he lost his job, his newspaper shut down, and the domain was sold. He hasn't written for anyone in 6 years. Doyle placed the business card in Nathan's hand. He kept the files. There was a name on the card. Tobias Renwick. Why are you giving this to me? Nathan asked. Doyle studied him for a long moment. Because I don't have enough rank to reopen that case, he said. And because you just paid $3,200,000 to stand inside it. Then he walked out. At 11 o'clock that morning, Nathan's phone vibrated. A Boston number, Vance. Prescott Lyle didn't offer a greeting. I just heard one of your men died in your basement. News travels fast. Listen until I'm finished. Lyle's voice was no longer cold. It sounded like nothing Nathan had ever heard from that man before. I know what you're thinking. You think it was me. For 6 years, every time someone died near that house, you thought it was me. And I let you think it because letting you believe I was dangerous was good for business, he exhaled. But I'm telling you, on everything I have, it wasn't me. It was never me. I walked away from that house in 2019 because someone called me at 1 o'clock in the morning, said exactly one sentence, and hung up, and I didn't sleep for 3 nights afterward. Nathan rose to his feet. What sentence? The other end remained silent for so long that he thought the call had disconnected. He said, Don't buy that yard, Lyle said. Someone's already cutting the grass. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, Ida Ferraro knocked on the library door. Caroline unlocked it. Ida didn't step inside immediately. She stood at the threshold, looking at the 10-foot table, the humidity chamber, the 14 antistatic bags stacked in the corner, and the dog lying beside the strip of black leather, and she looked for a long time. Then she entered and closed the door with her own hand. Miss Beckett, she said. I have worked in this house for 31 years. She didn't approach the table. She remained where she was, both hands folded in front of her apron, in the exact posture she had used when reciting the 3 rules. Mr. Ostrander hired me in 1994. I was here before he owned this house. I was here through all of it, and I was here on that night in September. Caroline set the micro spatula down. They questioned me the next morning. I told them I hadn't heard anything. That was the truth, and it was also the last time I told the truth about this matter for 6 years. Her voice was even. She had rehearsed these words for a long time. Then Warwick kept me here on the payroll of a vacant estate, making sure that the building didn't rot and keeping me under his thumb. Do you understand why? Because I knew the plumbing, I knew the kitchen, and I knew how this house breathed. That was the reason they gave. But the real reason was that it is easier to watch someone when you keep them close than when you let them go out into the world. She looked down at her hands. 31 years, and for the last 6 I have slept with the light on. Caroline didn't ask anything. She had learned there were moments when questions ruined everything. I lied to you about one thing, Ida said. On Wednesday, in the exact place where you are sitting now, I told you that Mr. Ostrander kept a piano there. She looked up. There was never a piano in that place. No one in this house has ever played one. The library fell silent. That was the sentence he taught me, Ida said. Mr. Ostrander. 3 weeks before that night, he called me into the kitchen and said, Ida, if the day ever comes when someone asks you about those 10 feet of wall, tell them that was where I kept the piano. Say that sentence, then walk away. Don't say another word, she exhaled. I asked him why. He said because the person who believes that answer will leave. The person who doesn't believe it will stay and discover the truth alone. And I need the second person, not the first. Caroline sat perfectly still. 4 people have asked me about that wall during the last 6 years, Ida said. 4 people. I gave all 4 of them the same answer. All 4 nodded and kept walking. She reached into the pocket of her apron. You were the 5th. You were the only one who asked again. She placed something on the long table. It was small, made of steel, with a number stamped into its surface. A safe deposit box key. He gave me this on that same day, Ida said. He didn't tell me what was inside the box. He only said, don't open it. Keep it until you meet the right person. Caroline looked at the key. She didn't touch it. How did you know it was me? Ida Ferraro looked toward the corner of the room, where the 150-pound dog lay with his muzzle resting on the black leather. I didn't, she said. He did. She turned toward the door. I have waited 6 years to find someone that trusted, she said without looking back. The day you knelt down in the hallway, I nearly fell. I had begun to believe I would die before it ever happened. Then she left and closed the door behind her. The bank on Westminster Street in Providence opened at 9 o'clock on Wednesday morning. Caroline and Nathan were escorted down to the vault, then left alone inside a small room with a steel table. Box number 411. There was no money inside, no gold, no hard drives. There were 2 things. The first was a piece of paper folded into quarters, about the size of a hand, bearing an address written in small, even handwriting that slant slightly to the right. A road in Bar Harbor, Maine. No name, no telephone number, only 1 line written beneath it in the same hand. If the person holding this paper isn't accompanied by the dog, don't answer the door. The second item was a photograph. A printed photograph, about 6 inches by 4 inches, slightly yellowed at one corner. 3 subjects. On the left stood a man with salt and pepper hair, thin, framed glasses, and a shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He was laughing and wasn't looking at the camera, and Caroline knew who he was because she had been reading his handwriting for 4 days. On the right was a woman. She was bending down, her loose hair covering half her face, and her hands were holding something that was trying to crawl out of the frame. In the middle, on the grass, was a puppy. He was black. He was fat. Loose folds of skin hung around his neck, and his head was far too large for his body, and his mouth was open around one of the woman's fingers. Around his neck was a brand new black leather collar that hadn't yet faded, with a brass tag that was still bright. Caroline turned the photograph over. 3 handwritten words appeared on the back. The Golden Summer. They left at 4 o'clock in the morning. Nathan drove. No driver, no escort vehicle, and no one knew they had gone. Caroline sat in the front passenger seat with the photograph in her coat pocket and the quarter-folded piece of paper in her hand. In the back seat, taking up the entire bench, Max lay on his side with his head resting on the strip of black leather. 6 hours through 4 states. Portsmouth at dawn, Portland at 7 o'clock. Then Route 1 carried them north as the force began closing in on both sides. No one spoke during the first 4 hours. By the time they reached Ellsworth, Caroline unfolded the photograph and looked at it again. He wrote this note 3 weeks before he died, she said. He knew he was going to die. He knew Nathan's dead. That was the entire conversation. They reached Bar Harbor at 10:10. The address led them out of town and onto a dirt road running along the mountainside, and at the end of it stood a small, single-story wooden house painted pale gray, with a steep roof and no smoke rising from the chimney. There was no car. A small flower bed in front of the porch had been tended with great care. Nathan turned off the engine. He opened the rear door, and Max climbed out slowly. one joint at a time, then stood on the dirt looking toward the house without moving. Caroline knocked. There was no sound for 30 seconds. Then came the movement of a latch. The door opened about 8 inches, the security chain still fastened, and half of a woman's face appeared in the gap. Short silver hair, 63 years old. She looked at Caroline for 1 second, then looked past Caroline's shoulder and saw the man standing beside the car. Her expression didn't change, but the hand gripping the doorframe tightened until the knuckles turned white, and she began pushing the door shut. Then she looked down. About 13 feet from the porch, a black dog stood on the dirt. The woman went still. The door stopped halfway closed. She stared at him through the 8-inch opening, and no one spoke. And there was no sound except the wind moving across the mountainside. Then she unhooked the chain. She opened the door. She stepped onto the porch, barefoot, took 2 steps, and stopped, both hands rising to cover her mouth. She didn't cry out, not a single sound. She simply stood there with both hands over her mouth, her entire body trembling in waves as though someone were shaking her by the shoulders, while tears ran over her wrists and fell onto the wooden boards. The dog didn't move. He watched her. She collapsed. She didn't sit down. Her knees slipped from the porch and she fell onto the earth, catching herself with both hands, and she couldn't rise again. Then Max walked toward her, 4 steps. He didn't run. He didn't leap onto her. He came to a stop directly in front of her and stood still. The woman lifted both hands. She didn't embrace him immediately. First, she touched both sides of his face, pressing her palms against the loose cheeks of the 150-pound animal, holding his 26-pound head between her hands as she looked into his eyes. He breathed out against her neck. Then she wrapped her arms around him. Each tightly touched his neck, buried her face in the black fur at his shoulder, and cried aloud for the first time in 6 years, and the dog stood perfectly still. He didn't move even an inch. He let the full weight of his body lean slightly toward her so she would have something to hold herself against, and he stood there, and he endured it. Caroline turned her face away. Nathan Vance remained beside the car with one hand still resting on the open door, and he didn't come forward, and he said nothing, and he stood that way for a very long time. On the dirt outside a gray wooden house in Bar Harbor, Maine, a woman whom the entire state of Rhode Island believed had died on a September night in 2019, mentioned the dog she had raised from the time he was 8 weeks old. She had named him in the summer of 2017. She hadn't known he was still alive. She hadn't known anything for 6 years except a false name, a rented house, a flower bed, and a fear powerful enough to keep a human being frozen in place without the nudge for any chain at all. It was a long time before she finally lifted her head. Her eyes found Nathan. She looked at him through her tears and spoke her first words. "You're Everett's son." It wasn't a question. Nathan didn't answer. She tightened her arms around the dog's neck slightly. "Come inside," she said. "Don't stand out there." In the kitchen of the wooden house, there was a table, 3 chairs, and a dog lying at the woman's feet, refusing to move more than 18 inches away from her. Rosalind Ostrander poured the tea with both hands because one hand alone wouldn't stay steady. "He gave me 6 characters," she said. "He didn't write them down. He made me memorize them. 3 weeks before that night. He said, 'Roz, one day someone will come and ask you for this, and if that person arrives without Max, you tell them you don't understand what they're talking about. You can keep saying that until the day you die.'" She looked down at the dog beneath her chair. "Then he said there were 6 more characters I didn't need to know. They were somewhere safer than I was." Caroline placed the collar on the table. Black leather faded to brown, a brass buckle tarnished green, and a brass tag engraved with the name Max, and beneath it, R. Ostrander. She put on her magnifier. She turned over the inside of the leather strap. It was smooth. There was nothing there. She moved along it with the tip of one finger inside a nitrile glove, slowly, from the buckle toward the end, and about 1.5 inches from the buckle, her finger stopped. There was a seam. Black thread against black leather, stitched by hand, not by machine. Someone had cut the leather open and sewn it closed again. Caroline looked at Rosalind. Rosalind nodded once. Caroline cut the thread with the edge of a micro spatula. The leather separated into 2 thin layers, and between them, stamped into the inner surface of the outer layer, about 0.02 of an inch deep, were 12 characters. They hadn't been written. They had been stamped with the kind of metal punches leatherworkers used to mark names. They wouldn't fade. They wouldn't bleed. They would remain there until the leather itself rotted into dust. My 6 were the first 3 characters, and the last 3, Rosalind said quietly. He told me to read them alternately. Warwick staged my death that night. He brought in the body of an unidentified woman, set the guest house on fire, and left her there to burn so the police would officially declare me dead and stop looking. Then he locked me away in this exile, under the constant, watchful eye of a caretaker he paid to live next door. It was only when your organization descended into chaos this past week that my shadow finally disappeared, allowing me to step onto this porch without fear. Warwick's paid watcher had made it clear, if I ever tried to run or contact the authorities, they would track down Max and end his life, and they would ensure Everett's son met a similar fate. I stayed to keep them both alive. Caroline studied the 12 characters through the magnifier and sat motionless for a long time. He hid it somewhere his enemy would never look, she said. Not inside a safe, not inside a wall. It's inside something he loved. Warwick cut Max open back then because he foolishly believed Bram had programmed the decryption key directly into the dog's microchip. While Warwick was frantically searching the physical body of the dog and eventually giving orders to discard him, the real key remained silently stamped on to the leather collar, which sat locked away inside the concrete vault where Warwick's men never thought to look. The guard tasked with putting Max down simply stitched the dog up and abandoned him at the shelter, lying to Warwick that the deed was done. Halloran connected drive number 1 at 9 o'clock that evening, in the kitchen of the wooden house in Bar Harbor. After drying it for 4 hours inside a reverse humidity chamber Caroline had built from a plastic container and a packet of desiccant, the reed head released. The drive began to spin. Halloran entered the 12 characters. Screen changed. The 14 drives weren't filled with useless data. They contained 18,000 files. Photographs of transfer orders, photographs of approval signatures, recordings of meetings, statements from 6 shell companies, and inside the final folder, titled Ross, 31 scanned pages. Nathan read them standing up. Bram Ostrander hadn't merely counted. 3 days before his death, he had done one final thing. He was the last signatory in the chain. Every dollar removed from the Vance Fund had to pass through his hands at the final stage so it could be legitimized as an operating payment. During those 3 days, he left every document unchanged, left every transaction code unchanged, left everything exactly as it appeared from above, and altered only one field. The final beneficiary account number. $10,200,000 had gone to Liechtenstein. It had flowed into a trust established in Rhode Island, irrevocable, and protected by a beneficiary safeguard clause, meaning the assets inside it were beyond anyone's control, couldn't be claimed, couldn't be transferred, and couldn't be touched by creditors or third parties under any order. Bram hadn't taken the money for himself. He hadn't taken it for anyone. He had locked it away forever. The sole beneficiary appeared on page 29, one line, with no second line beneath it. Rosalind Ostrander. Rosalind set down her teacup. I didn't know, she said. He never spoke to me about money. Not once Caroline understood before Nathan did. She stood so quickly that the chair fell backward. 6 years, she said. For 6 years he didn't interrogate you. He didn't beat you. He never even threatened you in any meaningful way. He only kept you frozen in one place under a false name inside a rented house. In Maine, she turned toward Nathan. Do you understand why? Nathan understood now. The missing money would only be discovered when the transfers came due for reconciliation. Bram died on September 20th. The reconciliation period ended at the close of the month. That meant the man sat down at a desk during the final days of September, opened the ledger, and discovered that $10,200,000 had vanished, while the only person alive who knew where it had gone had already been lying in the morgue for 10 days. He could no longer interrogate him. He had killed too soon. And that trust could only be activated while its beneficiary remained alive and appeared in person to sign. If Rosalind Ostrander died, the money wouldn't fall into anyone else's hands. It would remain frozen forever under the contingency clause, or pass to a designated charity listed on page 31, and no order from any court could pull it back out. He hadn't kept her alive out of mercy. He had kept her alive because she was the only remaining key to $10 million he had killed to obtain and could never touch. For 6 years he had waited for her to remember. For 6 years she hadn't known she possessed anything worth remembering. Nathan Vance placed the papers on the table. He didn't touch them again. "This money isn't mine," he said. Then he looked at Rosalind Ostrander. "But I need what's inside the other 13 drives." They returned to Newport the following night. Rosalind remained in Maine with 2 of Nathan's men standing outside beside the flower bed, and she didn't want to leave, and she wouldn't let the dog go until Caroline promised to bring him back to her. In the library, one thing remained unfinished: the final pair of pages in the notebook. They had been at the very bottom, where the leather cover had rested directly against the concrete for 6 years, and they weren't fused in pairs. 6 pages had fused together. A block of paper about 1/8 of an inch thick, as hard as a thin piece of wood. Caroline placed them inside the humidity chamber at 10 o'clock on Friday morning. She held them humidity at 75% for 7 hours instead of 6. She opened the chamber at 5 o'clock that afternoon and began separating them. And the first 3 pairs took her 1 hour and 40 minutes, and those 3 pairs were blank. There were only numbers. Statements. The final pair, the 4th pair, took 9 hours. She worked inward from the outer edge, following the grain of the paper, roughly 1/25 of an inch at a time, and every time the spatula blade met a section where the fibers hadn't released, she withdrew it and waited 20 minutes. She didn't eat. She didn't stand. At 2:10 on Saturday morning, the 2 sheets finally released each other with the faintest sound, almost like a breath, and she laid them beneath the glass, and she read. The date in the upper left corner was September 1st, 2019, 3 weeks before his death. Caroline read the entire page. Then she read it again. Then she sat motionless for 3 minutes. Then she stood and went to find Nathan. He was in his second-floor office. She placed the sheet on the desk before him beneath the glass, stepped back nearly 10 feet, and said nothing. The handwriting was small and even, slanting slightly to the right. Bram Ostrander had written, "I went looking into the past because I needed to know how far he had gone before. And I found out, and I wish I hadn't." The accident in 1999 wasn't an accident. The gardener put Everett Vance Sr. and his wife inside that car. He knew the road. He knew the time. He knew the brakes. Everett intended to make the organization legitimate within 5 years, and he wouldn't allow that to happen, so he stopped it in 50 seconds on a curve along Route 114. The child survived because he was sitting in the back seat. That was the only reason. There was no other reason. That child is grown now, destined to take his place at that table, and he is still calling the man who murdered his parents uncle. Nathan Vance didn't react. He read to the end. He didn't blink halfway through. When he finished, he didn't look up. And passed. Caroline stood nearly 10 feet away and counted them because she didn't know what else to do. For 40 seconds, the man sat motionless, staring down at a sheet of paper beneath the glass, and there wasn't a sound in the library, and outside, rain began falling over the sea. 40 seconds, exactly the same length of time he had stood on the second-floor landing and watched her kneel over the red wine stain. Then he rose. He didn't shove back the chair. He didn't pick up the page. He didn't say a word. He walked out of the room, descended the stairs, crossed the marble hall, opened the front door, and stepped into the rain. Max followed him. Caroline followed as far as the threshold and stopped there. Outside in the yard, beneath the rain, the 37-year-old man stood with his back to the house he had just paid $3,200,000 for. He didn't kneel. He didn't sit down. He only stood with both arms hanging at his sides, and within 1 minute, the rain had soaked through the shoulders of his shirt. The dog walked to him and stood close against his leg without moving. Very slowly, Nathan lowered one hand and placed it on the dog's head. He didn't stroke him. He simply left his hand there and kept it still. He stood that way for 18 minutes. Caroline knew because she remained at the threshold for all 18 of them, and she didn't step outside, and she didn't call his name, and she didn't tell him she was sorry, because she had learned a long time ago that there were moments when those words only made a person feel more alone. She simply stood there so that if he turned around, he would see that someone was still standing there. The rain grew heavier. His shoulders didn't move. From where she stood, she couldn't see his face. She would never know. 26 years. An 11-year-old boy sitting in the back seat. $15 bicycle bought from a pawn shop on Broad Street. 4 hours in the yard beneath a sky 21 degrees below freezing. A hand placed on his shoulder in the corridor behind an auction room and left there. A bottle of wine carried around a table. Every man called by the right name. Every detail of every life remembered. I wasn't raising a child. I was holding a place for a man. 26 years, and every kind thing Nathan Vance had ever received in his life had come from the same hand. Tobias Renwick was 29 years old and lived in a third-floor apartment in Pawtucket. And when Caroline placed the hard drive on his kitchen table at 4 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon, he sat motionless for 30 seconds before asking whether she was certain. "How long do you have?" she asked. 4 newsrooms in the FBI office in Boston. 90 minutes if I don't stop to use the bathroom. He had waited 6 years. He began typing. At 7 o'clock that evening, in the Vance house's large dining room, 8 men sat around the table. Warwick Hollis sat at the head, holding the wine bottle and walking around to pour for each man as he always did, asking how one man's daughter had done on her exam and remembering. Nathan sat to his right. He finished everything on his plate. He laughed once when the table laughed. He raised his glass when Warwick raised his. For 3 hours, not one of the 8 men saw anything at all. At 7:50, 2 patrol cars entered the gates. Detective Whitaker Doyle stepped into the marble hall carrying a search warrant and wearing the expression of a man who knew he was being used as a tool. "Someone called it in," he said quietly to Nathan at the foot of the staircase. "Anonymous. They're accusing you of murdering Merritt Kane." "My superior signed the warrant within 40 minutes. Nathan looked at the paper. Then he looked into the dining room, where Warwick Hollis was pouring more wine for the man in the third chair. By 8:15, the other 7 men had gone home. Warwick remained seated, the dining room door closed. He didn't rise. He didn't walk around the table. He didn't place a hand on anyone's shoulder. He only sat at the head of the table with a glass of wine before him, looking at Nathan, and perhaps for the first time in his 61 years, his face looked exactly its age. "When did you find it?" he asked. "Saturday." Warwick nodded slowly. "Did Bram write much?" "Enough." Warwick turned his wineglass once against the tabletop. "Your father was a fool," he said. His voice was still warm. That was the worst part. Everett intended to make the entire organization legitimate within 5 years. Do you know what that meant? It meant opening the books. It meant 30 men whose wives and children I knew by name in prison for 20 years. It meant the end. He was going to kill all of us, Nathan, and he believed he was saving us. He looked up. "I saved this. I kept it alive for 26 years. I built it for you. You killed my mother." Warwick didn't blink. "She was sitting in the wrong car," he said. There wasn't a sound in the dining room. Nathan Vance reached inside his coat. He drew out a gun. He didn't point it. He placed it on the wooden table and pushed it with 2 fingers, and it slid 16 inches before stopping exactly between them, about 8 inches from Warwick Hollis's hand. "I'm leaving it there," Nathan said. His voice was no louder than when he ordered coffee. "You choose." Warwick looked at the gun. He stared at it for a long time. Then he reached out. Something moved in the corner of the room. The dog didn't bark. He didn't growl. He didn't bare his teeth. He came to the table in 3 steps, placed both front paws on the wood, and 150 pounds rose between them, blocking Warwick Hollis's hand from the gun. He didn't bite. He only stood there. His wet eyes looked directly into the old man's face. Warwick Hollis froze. His hand stopped in midair, 6 inches from the weapon, and it began to tremble. He looked at the dog whose skin he had ordered cut open, whose microchip he had ordered removed, and whom he had abandoned at the rear entrance of a rescue shelter in another state at 4 o'clock in the morning so the animal could die without anyone asking a single question. And that same dog now stood 16 inches from his face and did nothing to him. He only looked. He looked at Warwick the way he had looked at everyone in that house for 6 years, without hatred, without anger, simply looking, and Warwick Hollis drew his hand back. He lowered it into his lap. His shoulders collapsed, and the entire room saw it. It wasn't the gun that defeated him. It was 16 inches and a pair of eyes that accused him of nothing. The door opened at 8:21. 4 people wearing blue windbreakers with 3 gold letters across their backs entered, and Doyle followed them, and the man in front spoke Warwick Hollis's name before he could rise. Nathan didn't move. In Pawtucket. 6 minutes earlier, Tobias Renwick had pressed send for the 5th time, leaned back in his chair, and watched all 4 progress bars reach the end. They handcuffed Warwick Hollis at the head of the table, where he had sat thousands of times. As they led him past Nathan, he turned his head. "You won't survive without me," he said. Nathan Vance looked at him. "I haven't been alive," he said. "Not for 26 years. Warwick Hollis was indicted under the Federal RICO Act on 14 counts. including 2 counts of organized murder. The trial lasted 4 months. The 18,000 files contained on the 14 hard drives required no additional witnesses because Ostrander had scanned every approval signature during the final 11 months of his life. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. But before that trial began, something happened that no one had anticipated. Nathan Vance went voluntarily to the FBI office in Boston without being summoned, and he brought the complete financial records of the Vance organization covering 18 years. Not only Warwick's part, everything, including his own. His attorney called it professional suicide. Nathan signed a plea agreement, accepted 1 count of conspiracy, and cooperated under a substantial assistance provision that prosecutors agreed to present to the court. The Vance organization was dismantled within 9 months. 31 people were indicted. Every remaining legitimate asset after forfeiture was transferred into a fund bearing the Ostrander name. Nathan Vance was sentenced to 26 months. Caroline visited him for the first time during the 3rd week, and they spoke through a pane of glass. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "If I didn't finish it," Nathan said, "then all 3 of them died for nothing." Warwick Hollis died in a federal prison in Pennsylvania during the 19th month of Nathan's sentence. Heart failure, 63 years old. Nathan didn't request permission to attend the funeral. He never spoke about it to anyone. 26 months passed. The mansion at the end of the quarter-mile gravel drive now had a small brass sign mounted beside the gates. The Beckett Ostrander Center for Document Restoration. It wasn't a museum, it was a school. Each class accepted 12 students, tuition was free, and the admission criteria consisted of only 1 line: for people who had been forced to abandon their education for financial reasons. The director was a 29-year-old woman who had completed her final 2 semesters the previous spring. After years of fearing, she had left her dreams behind forever. The afternoon course was taught by a 65-year-old woman. She taught the treatment of water-damaged paper. She said she had learned it from her husband, a man who had once sat inside that very room and written in a small, even hand that leaned slightly to the right. Ida Ferraro made coffee for the students, and she spoke far more than she once had, so much that the students sometimes had to remind her that class was about to begin. The $10,200,000 inside the trust belonged to Rosalind Ostrander. She kept $100,000 for the wooden house in Bar Harbor. She transferred everything else into the foundation bearing her husband's name. Caroline Beckett paid the $84,312 debt herself from her salary over 22 months. Nathan offered once through the glass. She said no. "You can't buy me," she said. "You only get to stay." On the morning he was released, no car was waiting, no guards. He took a bus to Newport, then walked up the quarter-mile gravel drive, and when he had covered nearly 400 yards, something moved on the porch. Max was now deep into his twilight years. His hindquarters had begun to weaken the winter before, and the veterinarian had told Caroline that the debris was at an advanced age, and she said it in the voice of someone who wanted Caroline to prepare herself. The dog rose. It took him 4 seconds to stand. Then he descended the 3 porch steps, 1 step at a time, and began to walk. He didn't run. He couldn't run anymore. He moved 1 step at a time across the gravel, nearly 44 yards, his head hanging low, and no one called to him, and no one came outside to meet him. Nathan Vance stopped in the middle of the road. Then he knelt. He knelt on the gravel and waited, and the dog crossed those 44 yards 1 step at a time, and when he reached him, he simply placed his heavy head against Nathan's chest and stood there. Caroline remained in the doorway. She didn't run outside. She had understood the order of things a long time ago. The dog came first. The person came afterward. Some truths don't need anyone to search for them. They lie quietly inside walls, inside paper, inside a faded collar, and they wait. They don't wait for the smartest person, and they don't wait for the most powerful. They wait for someone willing to stop and listen. Newport laughed at a man who paid $3,200,000 for a haunted house, and they were wrong about the price, because what lay behind that wall wasn't $10 million. It was 2 murdered people, a woman buried alive inside a false name for 6 years, and an 11-year-old boy who had embraced the wrong man for 26 years. And not one person in that auction room remembered the name of the woman who cleaned the floors. Now her name stood on the gates. The lesson left behind after everything that happened is simple. A person's dignity doesn't lie in the work they are doing, in the debt they are carrying, or in the car where they are sleeping. It lies in whether they are willing to stop and kneel at the same level as another living creature. The only person in that house who saw the truth was the person everyone inside it called by a noun instead of a name. Look closely at the people cleaning your floors, carrying your coffee, or standing in the corner of a room with a pitcher of water. They always see more than you imagine. Thank you for listening to this story until the very final moment. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so that more meaningful stories can reach more people every day. We would truly love to know how this story made you feel. Has anyone in your life ever been treated like a noun instead of a name? Has anyone ever knelt to meet you at your level while the entire world walked around you? Please leave a comment below. We read every single line, and we sincerely want to hear the deepest feelings in your heart. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.